War is immoral. Poverty is immoral. Racism is immoral. Police brutality is immoral. Oppression is immoral. Genocide is immoral. Imperialism is immoral. This country represents all those things. All those things. All those things. All those things.
Have you heard of the trad wife movement? It's one way women on the right have fallen victim to extremism. My global warning guest today has seen it with her own eyes, starting on January 6th. Noelle Cook is an ethnographer and researcher specializing in the online and offline participation of women in conspiratorial and right-wing movements. With a background in anthropology, she has spent years studying how identity, belief, and belonging shape extremist communities. How? She embedded herself. Noelle is the author of The Conspiracists, Women, Extremism, and the Lure of Belonging, as well as the researcher for and associate producer of The Conspiracists, a documentary film by Page 75 Productions. Both have received rave reviews. Noelle's work bridges academia and popular media, offering insights into the social and cultural forces that drive radicalization. She has presented her research in academic and media spaces, focusing on the intersection of gender, extremism, and disinformation. So, Noelle, thank you today for joining me. It is so great to have you. Today is January 15th, so we missed the anniversary of January 6th by about a week, but I'm sure you still have some feelings. Tell me what comes to mind when you think back to that day.
It's still very surreal to me, particularly when I think back to having been there on January 6th. And just to be clear of why I was a graduate student in 2021, and there was no in-person research because of the pandemic. So I decided to go down to DC while I was living in Maryland at the time to take photographs at the Stop the Steal rally. I had done photographs of other liberal events in the years leading up to that. And that was one of the only things I could think of that might produce a visual anthropology project, the radicalization pathways of women on the right, as well as then compare it to some of the photos I had done on the left. But I got something very different when I arrived at the Capitol that day. I got there very late because I was really debating on whether to go down because it was so cold that morning. And I got a late start.
Among other things.
Right. Well, I got a late start, and I really thought I was going down to see this rally, although I realized I was going to be late. So I was mostly going to get photos of people milling around that area of DC. But when I got there and walked from Union Station to the Capitol, we were told people were at the Capitol. So we walked that way. And that was very surreal, rounding the corner and seeing bodies plastered against the building. Because, having been a tourist in DC plenty of times, I know you're not allowed to even step on the bottom step of the building. You can't stand anywhere on the building. So I knew something was amiss immediately. But I started out on the east front, which was not the side with the tunnel. That was the west front. And the east front was people mostly milling around and sitting on the back steps there outside the rotunda. And when you're in DC with that kind of crowd, you don't get much cell service. And so it was kind of impossible to know at that moment what was actually happening. And it wasn't until I got home and turned the news on that I saw what was going on the inside.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing. And so when you're standing around there, you must have run into some people. Now, in my experience, I've never been a counter protester. So when I go to protests, I'm, unless of course I am considering someone as potentially being an infiltrator, the majority of the time I'm with my comrades, my peers, and it's a very clear enemy, so to speak. It's the police and the capitalist institution that we're there to fight. In this case, you're a journalist, you're a woman who is, not in agreement ideologically with these people, and you're surrounded by them. So how did you end up mixing with people who you may never have run across? And what about those conversations inspired you to take a next step beyond just taking photographs and doing work in academia?
I think the day it was happening, because I was approaching it with an academic project in mind, an ethnographic project specifically, that served as a nice shield in many ways, because ethnography doesn't demand pushback. It doesn't demand changing minds. It asks you to observe another culture, which is what I consider the MAGA movement to be another culture, and to understand what their practices mean to them. And so with that in mind, it was easier to navigate through that space that day. Plus, I didn't know what I was navigating through exactly. And then there's the sheer fact that I'm a middle-aged white woman. And I am, not only because of my age, am I mostly invisible, but I can pretty much move freely through spaces unquestioned. If I'm not there to be combatant, people just automatically assume that I'm one of them, or at least sympathetic to their cause, potentially.
Yeah.
And then that can be assumed without any prompting, just based on my appearance.
Which is so amazing. And I mean, I'll just throw this in there. I can relate not to being, a woman with blonde hair, obviously, but just the way that I look. I have cops and right wing types come up to me all the time thinking I'm one of them because I have a shaved head and neck tattoo. And so, a little off topic, but it's incredible what looks can tell people, whether it's true or it's not. It can dictate quite a bit about how they respond to you. So what was the response when you started like asking questions? What types of people were you meeting with, and what types of questions were you asking, and what was the response like?
Well, I didn't really speak to anyone in an interview capacity that day. I was literally just walking around taking photographs of people standing around, different groups. Um,
Yeah, just since that day, like throughout this
since that day.
whole, yeah, through the whole book writing process and everything.
Well, I started the first year observing on paper and on social media. And so I spent the whole first year studying court records and newspapers and social media accounts, which unfortunately middle-aged women aren't great with using their privacy controls. And so you can learn an awful lot through social media. So I spent the first year doing that. But at some point, some of the women I was following were leading me down paths I really became confused by. I expected the conspiracies. I expected right-wing extremism. But when we got into something that is called conspirituality, a term coined by sociologists in 2011 to describe the convergence of New Age spirituality and conspiracies, that's kind of where they all led me to. And so at some point after that first year, Yvonne, one of the women in the book, in particular, her journey became more complicated than I could follow without having some background. And so I reached out to her in one of our Facebook groups and I said, could you explain this to me? She gave me her cell phone number and said, call me. And so I did. And that happened with pretty much every woman I spoke to wanted to talk. And again, it wasn't interviews because I wasn't really doing that sort of project. I was trying to understand what things meant to them, what I was seeing. And so what I started out doing morphed and changed over those 3 or 4 years. Because by year 2, when I'm now having conversations with these women, I'm having to grapple with, wait a minute, what is this I'm feeling right now? Is this empathy? Am I feeling empathy for these people who are just grossly different than me, who I don't agree with on so many things, but yet just the fact that we were middle-aged women, we found things in common to talk about, which surprised me a bit. But you start to realize that regardless of which side you're on, women are going to have some similar experiences in this country. And so we spoke most of those years about our lives as middle-aged women, as mothers, as people who have gone through divorces, have experienced financial precarity because of that loss of status of marriage. And so that was surprising to me. And I really observed that in year 2, how I was finding some common ground. Because to be honest with you, we didn't talk politics. We talked about their spiritual journeys, which was a path directly from right-wing politics into conspirituality. But we didn't have to actually talk about any specifics until we did the road trip for the documentary and we were together in person for several days at a time. And that was when someone like Yvonne, for example, who believes she's an advanced being from a higher dimension here to help usher humanity into a new world, which was what they call Earth in 5D. It wasn't until I went on that trip with her that she started to realize I was actually firmly planted in the 3D world, and probably wasn't one of these advanced beings. I'm probably the sister in 3D here to help humans. So
Wow. So
it's
yeah,
true.
I definitely wanted to get into some of that because, for someone who hasn't read the book or someone who hasn't had access, doesn't have a
Mhm.
relative who thinks like this, it's foreign, very foreign. So, conspirituality, 5D, what among the many, I don't even know what you would call it, like conspiracy laden lifestyle choices or ideologies, among the many, what were some that stood out to you, either for being very common among this group, of, I guess, tell me, like, but middle-aged white women, and or what were some of the ones that struck you as most worth telling about?
Well, I think the one thing I noticed, especially as I began this research, and because so many of these women were leading me, I did not start out wanting to study conspiracies. I had hoped to stay as far away from QAnon as I could. But unfortunately, when I started doing this work, following these people through social media and their ideologies, I had no choice. I was led by all of them into conspiracies, and specifically the women led me into conspirituality. Some are into it more than others, but there were always pieces. And once you know the vocabulary and you hear the language, you hear it everywhere. What I would have heard 3 or 4 years ago, I might not have recognized. But I'll be standing in the grocery store and hear someone exclaim, "Oh, 1111." I know exactly what they're talking about. They're talking about the angel numbers 1111 that show up on the clock twice a day. So, but you don't realize how much of this language is seeped into the mainstream, and the pandemic was really the entry point. It was like the perfect storm for all of this. And I think the reason so many middle-aged women, because this is not a demographic we spend a lot of time talking about, middle-aged women, so it's pretty niche sounding. And yet, when you look at disinformation, studies have shown that the super spreaders of disinformation are middle-aged women because they are not discerning and will click retweet or repost indiscriminately. And so I thought that was interesting. If you look at the second Trump administration, the demographic that increased their support the second time around by 7 points were white middle-aged women. The only other demographic that came close to that were their sons. And so that tells me we have a problem. Like, what's going on with Gen X here? Why are we doing this? Why are we raising our children to do this? And so that's kind of an overarching question I still don't have the answer to, but kind of working into the next project.
Good,
But
because I want an answer to that.
yeah, and it really was. It was like that was the only pattern I could find from the first 100 women arrested. I was looking for affiliation, and the vast majority of them were not affiliated with an organized group.
Okay.
And so the only pattern I could find consistently was age. And that is how I ended up focusing on the middle-aged women, which kind of worked out for me. It was the first time being a
Well,
middle-aged
it's
woman turned out to be an advantage.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's an advantage, and it's also important, like you said, because it's not a group that's commonly considered, let alone studied. And then there's the part you mentioned where it's been determined that they're the super spreaders of
Mhm.
disinformation. So in all these ways, it's a critically important audience or community to understand. I guess I was going to ask you what were some of the most surprising things, but I feel like I already got the answer I wanted. I think how well you were able to kind of get along with them and not talk politics. That surprised me. But I guess, was there anything else? I should still ask you. Was there anything else that really took you by surprise that just stands out to you? Because this has been a few years in the making now.
Yeah, I did this for a long time and full time. And so I think the thing that surprised me most was less about what I heard, because we can all, it's hard to shock you after a while. You've kind of seen it all at this point, right? And the most absurd thing is working here in reality now. I think what surprised me most was how I changed in this. That was the most surprising piece. Especially once I went into year 2 and was actually making contact and then starting to I would say, develop relationships with these people, right? I had to grapple with that quite a bit. How am I feeling this empathy for people who I disagree with so wholeheartedly on so many issues? Which is, which was the advantage of doing something over time and getting to know people as people, right? But this is also something I have to recognize as a really privileged position to be able to do. Because I'm not part of one of the marginalized communities who's targeted and attacked, right? Just as I described before, I'm pretty benign. I'm a middle-aged white woman, so people don't look twice at me usually. But I hadn't, that's a privilege to be able to sit down and have rational conversations with people that that if I was part of another group, I know what they would think of my life, the quality or the value of my life. So that's a disconnect for me, and that was a hard one to reconcile. Is how could I be feeling empathy for people who on one hand are talking about taking away rights of lots of people for different reasons.
I'm going to tell you the answer. It's because even if you don't know it, you're an abolitionist just like me. And I'll explain what that means. Well, I'm not going to get into detail about what abolition is, but one of the key elements to it is the understanding that all of us are the products of years of training, whatever it might be. We are fed information in school. We are fed information on TV and other forms of media from our friends, as you pointed out, from our parents. And so, in other words, most perpetrators in a variety of ways are also victims. And when we believe really strongly about something and it tends to, create problems because there's hate involved or there's disinformation involved, it can be traced to a place, and thus I think it can also be addressed. You relate to these women because as women you've all gone through similar things as women, and being able to empathize with them as people who have been put in a position where they've allowed themselves to go down this path, that just means that you're recognizing that they're human beings and that they've been transformed once. It's not your job to transform them. You're an ethnographer, but someone else might be able to do that because they are just human beings at the end of the day, and they have feelings and they got to this place from somewhere. But I am curious about that. Have you gotten any pushback from people on the far left, or I'm going to guess not other academics, but from maybe people who don't understand what it means to truly embed yourself in a community like this? Have there been people who've questioned your allegiances?
No, but that was one of my big concerns early on, and I kind of addressed that up front, though. Also, and I haven't gotten as much pushback from my side as I expected to, and again, I think partly it's coming at something with an academic lens to start with. So when I explain the method I'm using, even though I kind of bastardized that method, which is why it's no longer an academic project and it's a book, because academia doesn't want you to get personal, right? But it's really hard to understand people if you're hovering above them and making these
And that's what makes it good.
Well, it's what makes it different for sure. Yeah,
and better,
because people are not all one thing, as you know. Right. And so I can have empathy for these people as humans and the experiences they've had in their lives. But at the same time, I can also say what you did on January 6th was wrong. And yes, you deserve a consequence for that. Right. I mean, both things can be true. And again, I'm also looking at a population. I chose to study the ordinary women that got involved, not people who already had some sort of position as influencer or who was already affiliated with a organized group. Because I think, especially when dealing with conspiracists, looking at motivation for why they're continuing to perpetuate these messages is really important, because everyone's got a different motivation. And for Tammy and Yvonne, who are true believers, which is why I only settled on 2 women at the end of the day. I had to cipher through, I probably had 12 different women I was talking to for a while. But it became very clear, this person's trying to position themselves as a J6 influencer. And this person now is going to use it to further her alt wellness prophecies, right? And so when you see people have a motivation that's self-serving, it's not, you don't learn as much. But when you find true believers, you can learn a lot about it. And what I really came to believe was that so many people using conspiracies are using them as coping mechanisms, to explain the unexplainable. Why do these bad things keep happening to me? Broken systems, rather than looking at the politicians and the broken systems, it's easier to look at the trans agenda or Antifa as the problem, right? It's much easier to create a fictional boogeyman for everybody to be afraid of. But what was interesting to me is to watch some of these women. They got further down that rabbit hole, that conspirituality rabbit hole, after January 6th. There was some dabbling prior, but again, when I talk about using conspiracies as a coping mechanism, I watch people go even further all in after January 6th. And again, we're dealing with, this is a huge trauma event in these people's lives. Most of these people did not have criminal backgrounds. And so the proposition of going to federal prison was a big deal, right? In Yvonne's case, she had done time in the brig for a dishonorable discharge in the Marines back in the early 2000s. But the vast majority of those women who were arrested didn't have criminal records. They were literally ordinary women. And, people often say, I guess there were all those men there, and they were wearing their body armor and their camo, and they were spewing their violent rhetoric, while women were sitting around in the pictures I took, taking selfies, and it felt almost like a sinister carnival atmosphere, and yet there was a weird camaraderie going on with all these people, and I recognized the feeling. And again, so much of this is about feeling, not facts. And I remember the Women's March, the original Women's March I went to in 2017 in DC, where we were packed shoulder to shoulder. You could not move. There were so many people. But it was like this feeling of like absolute solidarity, right? And it felt so good that day. And you were kind of with your people. And I know that feeling. And I know how easy it is to kind of lose yourself in that feeling. Now, the Women's March didn't have opportunities to become violent or storm buildings, but I see, the vast majority of the people on the Capitol grounds that day did not enter the Capitol. And I know that's one thing on my side you don't necessarily want to hear. But when you look at pictures of that rally that day, there were so many people there. And then when you see the pictures from the Capitol afterwards, there's a lot of people there. There's several thousand for sure. But when you look at the arrests and the estimated number of people on the inside, it was a pretty small faction of people. And then you go a step farther, and how many people did I see with zip ties hung to their belt loops? How many people did I see with flagpoles whittled into points? And I did see that. But the vast majority of the people I saw were out in the grass area on the East Front doing prayer circles or meeting up with people they knew from maybe online, right? And so it was almost like I think I said in the book at one point, I felt like in ways it was like being at a big Gen X high school reunion if you had gone to a high school of all white people.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, that is not that different from what it's like going to a protest as a leftist. There are people doing direct actions. There are people more on the outskirts. And then there are people who are more casual observers who are there to feel that vibe, to be part of the community and the movement. And I think that was such an important point you just made, that those similarities, that is why a lot of people are coming there, no matter which side you're from. It's this feeling that we all have in this country of confusion, of alienation, of feeling like the government doesn't care about us, and not knowing who to blame for that because we don't feel like we have any power either. So I'm just curious, are there any other similarities, coming more from the left and knowing crazy people like me? Are there any other things that you witnessed or heard that may have reminded you of people on the far left? And again, this is not something we want to hear either, but I think it's super important. Like, there's a difference between leftist extremists and right wing. One is for love, one's for hate. But beyond that, there's some similarities too in the way we organize and the way we act and how passionate we are, et cetera.
Yes, although I will say the right is much better at some of this organizing because the right puts money into it, right? Someone like you, for example, would be being paid by some organization to keep your show going and to keep sucking people in. And the left doesn't do that so much. So you have a lot of people who have a lot of knowledge to share, but there's no one out there hiring them to do it. And that's that's the part of the problem I see on the left.
Yeah, nicely said.
But you know what the problem is with that is, on the left, we have problems too with disinformation and conspiracies, and some of that is this ecosystem that creates this competition for an audience, where influencers have to figure out how to keep you engaged and coming back for more, and playing on emotion typically is the way that happens. Sometimes it can be celebratory, but oftentimes it's to keep you enraged or fearful. And you know, there's a lot of, I would say maybe the left doesn't quote lie quite as much, but by omission of big chunks of information and just making it bombastic or spectacle or sensational, we're doing the same thing the other side
You're
does.
right.
And we also have the same group of middle-aged women who are super spreaders of disinformation and propaganda.
Totally,
you know?
totally. And I
The left is
rely
not
on
immune.
those women. No,
I know.
you are so right. And all of that is so real. That hits home. I mean, because yeah, like I have a lot to say, but I am not making a ton of money saying it, and no one wants to give me money to say it. And probably one of the reasons, it's not lack of information, it's not lack of experience. I've been doing this a long time. It might be because I have conversations like this or have cats jump on my shoulders. But outside of that, I think it's really that I'm not here to get you to say the craziest thing you can possibly say.
Right.
I want to know what we're living in right now, and it's just everyone's giving me their perspective on this. What are we living in right now, and what can we do to fix it? That's just not as exciting as, like,
No.
I don't know, you know, some of the other stuff that's being yelled across the internet.
Being
So
combative
thank
is
you for
much more
pointing
fun.
that out. Yeah. And the world is tough enough without me doing that on my show. So on that note, this conversation has flown by. I'm like twice past what I'm supposed to be doing here, but I do want to get one more thing out of you. For the general population, those of us who are less concerned about which side of the political aisle we're on or how extreme or not extreme we are, we just want to see good in this world. We don't want to see hate at the micro or the macro level. What is the best thing that we can do right now?
Wow, I mean, I'm going off of what I do here. What I have
Yeah.
found is I approach people with curiosity. I think even if my first instinct is you're abhorrent, you know, there's just, if you approach people with curiosity and you ask questions, you can start to learn a lot. And I feel like by doing that, by having conversations with people, I feel like I'm doing my very small part in kind of dispelling this myth that every liberal woman is a Karen or everybody I'm going to attack. I think that's a surprise to people when I don't go at them. But I think if you want to learn about people, if you want to understand where they're coming from, you have to approach it with curiosity, and you have to be willing to listen to that. That doesn't mean giving up any of your own beliefs. I don't do that. I've not changed a single belief I had prior to this. In fact, if anything, I probably radicalized further left. Right. But at the same time, what's so strange and disconnected from this new age spirituality that people have adopted, as opposed to, you think, okay, you're backing away from the apocalyptic Christian nationalism, but it's the same. It's still got the same elements into it. I was very surprised to see something that you typically think of as very lefty, kind of like a hippie-ish, new age stuff, to go to something like the Conscious Life Expo and then hear all the anti-government conspiracies, to see Del Bigtree, who is probably the world's largest purveyor of anti-vax information, right? Which was another thing that you have to remember on January 6th. Not everybody there that day was there for the Stop the Steal rally. There was another rally going on the Lower Senate Park that day, which was an anti-COVID-19 mandate. And that it was kind of going after Fauci and that whole thing. So there were a lot of women who were at that rally who ended up at the Capitol as well. And I think the disinformation, and I'm not sure how you get people out of that now, because all of the wacky conspiracists that were everywhere in 2022 are now sitting in places like Health and Human Services and the FBI. And so we're in a situation where we already had all these true believers who have changed. It is less about ideology now. It's about community participation, belonging. Where are you going to spend 16 hours a day if you're not in your online groups, right? Disagreeing with an idea also makes you have to consider, do I want to give up my community? What am I going to do for all those hours every day if I'm not online in these groups? So there's a lot of questions people have to reconcile before they can just walk away.
Yeah. So maybe one of those solutions is, someone coming up with alternative groups that can attract these people and
Right.
pull out some of that, negative stuff that creates harm and I don't know,
And there is one
tears us
group.
apart more, right? So tell me about that.
Well, there's a man I met in 2023, Rich Loges, who is a former Trump supporter and was heavily involved in politics in Florida and Trump activist, just for lack of a better word. And at some point during the COVID pandemic, he started listening to contradictory statements by various politicians about the vaccine and the virus, and started having his own doubts. And that's how he kind of made his way out of the movement. He has created an organization called Leaving MAGA. And it's because he recognizes through his own journey, when you leave it, where do you go? What do you do? When so many people now have kind of moved their social activities online,
Right.
what do you do when you don't get to do that anymore? And so he recognized the need for community. And I think that's been
Smart.
Interesting to watch over the last couple of years as people have doubts. There is a place to go and they can find Rich, and it's leavingmaga.org.
Okay.
And there's a support group there. So you have meetings for families and friends who want to come. And so that's I think one of the best ways is trying to create new communities to land in, and communities of formers, perhaps, because there's no one you can learn the most from the formers, to be honest. So
yeah, and I've met a few over the last few years too, and they're all very committed to getting the information out there also. And then, before I let you go, there's also Daryl Lamont Jenkins and One People's Project, who help people leave that world and, find alternative ways of thinking and being in community. So yeah, and he was a guest. He was my first guest, and you're my 10th guest. Yeah. So this is a nice tie up to all of that. I definitely recommend people read your book, watch The Conspiracists as well, because there's so much more in depth about what conspirituality is, for instance, and what it's really like to be a part of that movement. So is there anything else that I didn't ask you want to make sure my audience knows before I let you go?
I'll just touch on what you started with the introduction when you talked about trad wives, and we did not talk about trad wives during this conversation.
Thank you.
So people might be like, "Where did that come from?"
That's my bad journalism. Good job.
No, it's good, because the trad wife may seem like it has absolutely no connection to what we just talked about with January 6th and conspirituality, but unbeknownst to me, it does, right? Because there's various kinds of trad wives, just like there's various kinds of conspiracists. And the thing with the right that I have found, you can have a trad wife, and you can have someone who believes they're a starseed from a higher dimension, which is basically alien DNA. You can have a white nationalist or a Christian nationalist, and you can all swim in that same pool. Everyone's got their lane. And if you stay in your lane, you're fine with adjacent to, there's some neo-Nazis over there. I might not be okay with everything they believe, but I'm okay traveling next to them. And that's what was so bizarre to me. And trad wives came up because I started seeing those hashtags. And then when I started following trad wives, I was seeing new hashtags. And this is important because I'm watching these women with vintage sewing patterns and showing how these made these dresses and sourdough starters. But then I start looking at block hashtags, and I'm, homemaking, homesteading. But then I see revolt against the modern world. I see that over and over time in these different women's, trad wife spaces. And so I finally Googled it, and it's the title of a book by Julia Savola, who was a 1930s fascist in Italy, who claimed to be more fascist than Mussolini, right? And so you see how one day, and this is why the pandemic was such a perfect storm. is women were online for the very first time in many cases looking how to homeschool their kids because they were now responsible for keeping their kids in front of a computer doing their work for that year. And so as you're Googling, what are the tips for keeping my 5-year-old sitting in front of a computer, you're going to be getting fed more and more of the whole homeschool content, which we already know lives on the right, either through biblical womanhood or trad wives or whatever. But it also moved into another space that looks very crunchy lefty when you first look at it. You know, homesteading and self-sufficiency, accelerationism comes in left and right. And so you start to see how all of these different ideologies coalesce and work together to support common goals, which oftentimes, although very few people I've talked to would actually say this and agree with me, but if you really break it down to its bottom level, it's the identity of whiteness. You know, that is really
Absolutely.
what every one of these groups across the board, you know, you might think you're a Pleiadian from a higher dimension and alien DNA, or you might be a staunch, you know, Christian nationalist, biblical womanhood, and those things don't seem to match up. You know, how is that person going to accept an alien hybrid? But if the end goal, if everyone's end goal is this same place, that's how it works.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's how they are so much, among the other things you pointed out, so much better organized than us, because we're busy purity testing and taking every little minutia of like belief system and you know, questioning and criticizing instead of joining together for a common cause. And our common cause would probably be better for all of us, even for those who may disagree. Whereas that doesn't always work in the opposite.
No.
Noelle, thank you so much. This was great. I could talk to you for hours. Everybody who's been watching, thank you for joining us. Thank you for staying on a little extra. Be sure to check out Noelle's work. It's incredible and it's a unique niche that's definitely worth investigating. See you soon for episode 11.
War is immoral. Poverty is immoral. Racism is immoral. Police brutality is immoral. Oppression is immoral. Genocide is immoral. Imperialism is immoral. This country represents all those things. All those things. All those